Ruth stared at the rejection email on her laptop screen, her heart sinking with every word. "Another we regret to inform you message." It had been months of unanswered prayers, and nothing seemed to change. She closed her laptop, leaning back on the worn couch of her small apartment. Her Bible lay untouched on the coffee table, its pages begging to be opened, but Ruth couldn't bring herself to read it. What was the point? God didn't seem to hear her anymore. She sighed deeply, looking out the window, watching the rain trickle down. "How long, Lord? How long do I have to wait?" Sunday morning came, and Ruth sat quietly in the church pew, barely listening to the sermon. The pastor spoke on the theme of patience and trusting in God's timing, but Ruth couldn't focus. All she could think about was the stack of job rejections and her growing loneliness. After the service, she lingered near the exit, overhearing snippets of conversations. A few women were excitedly sharing stories of answered prayers. One had gotten a promotion, another was engaged, and a third had just moved into her dream home. Ruth slipped out the door, feeling like an outsider. Where were her answers? She had prayed just as hard, hadn't she? As she stepped out of the church hall, Ruth noticed a young couple, Mark and Jenna, discussing their recent struggles. They were trying to start a family but had faced several setbacks. Ruth approached them, sensing a shared bond of waiting. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly. "I understand a bit about waiting myself." As Ruth spoke with Mark and Jenna, she felt an unexpected sense of connection. They shared stories of their challenges and fears, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her struggles. They exchanged phone numbers, promising to support each other. Please take few seconds to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. After the conversation, Ruth felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps waiting wasn't just about her individual journey. Maybe it was about how they could uplift each other. It sparked something in her, a desire to build community even in her waiting. Wednesday night Bible study was more of a habit now than anything else, but Ruth went anyway. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was hope, but she still showed up. During the study, Ruth found herself sitting next to Mrs. Clara, an older woman she had seen in church many times but never spoken to. Mrs. Clara had a warmth about her, a calmness that made Ruth feel at ease. As they chatted, Ruth let slip her frustrations about waiting, about how her prayers seemed to vanish into thin air. Mrs. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes kind. "I've been there," she said. "Believe me, I know a thing or two about waiting." She smiled, and something in Ruth stirred an invitation to listen. "Would you like to have coffee sometime? I'd love to share my story." Ruth agreed, curious but still skeptical. What could the woman possibly tell her about waiting? The cafe smelled of fresh pastries and coffee beans as Ruth sat across from Mrs. Clara. The older woman took a slow sip of her tea, her hand steady. "I was married at 22, Mrs. Clara began, and I prayed every day for my husband to come to know the Lord. I waited and waited. It took 20 years, Ruth." She smiled softly at the shock in Ruth's eyes. 20 years of praying, and for most of that time, it seemed like nothing was happening. "I can't tell you how many nights I wanted to give up." 20 years, Ruth repeated, feeling a lump form in her throat. "How did you keep going?" Mrs. Clara's eyes softened. "By remembering that God's timing isn't ours. I realized that while I was waiting for God to answer my prayers, He was working on me, shaping me in ways I didn't understand at the time." As weeks passed, Ruth became more involved in church activities. She joined a small group where members shared their own waiting stories. One evening, Ruth heard from Emily, a young single mother waiting for a stable job to support her child. "Some days are harder than others," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "I worry about how I'll make ends meet, but I hold on to hope." Ruth found herself drawn to Emily's resilience and decided to support her by helping with childcare when possible. These connections began to strengthen Ruth's sense of community. She realized that each person's waiting journey was unique yet shared a common thread: a desire for purpose and fulfillment. One day, after a rainy afternoon, Ruth sat in a park, watching the droplets dance on the leaves. She pulled out her journal and reflected on the conversations she'd had. "Maybe this waiting isn't just about my job," she wrote. "Maybe it's about trusting God no matter what." In her journal, she began to jot down the stories of those around her, realizing how their struggles paralleled her own. Each entry became a reminder that waiting was a shared experience, and in that, there was beauty. The journey wasn't without its challenges. Ruth faced another job rejection, which hit harder than the last. This time, she couldn't hold back the tears. Sitting on her couch, knees pulled up to her chest, she whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, God." She grabbed her bag and walked to the park, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. But the walk didn't calm her. Her thoughts were in turmoil. "If you're really there, Lord," she whispered under her breath, "please do something fast. I've come to the end of myself. I don't know what to do again. Do anything, show up for me." As Ruth walked along the park path another time, her eyes fell on a small flower growing between the cracks of the sidewalk. It was tiny, but it was thriving in such an unexpected place. For a moment, Ruth stopped, staring at it. Something about that small flower gave her pause. She bent down, gently touching the petals. "Even here, life grows," she murmured. A strange peace washed over her, as if God were saying, "I'm still here. I'm working, even in the cracks." Ruth stood up, a flicker of hope sparking in her heart. Later that week, she attended a church event where she saw Mark and Jenna again. They shared that they were moving forward with adoption after years of waiting, which inspired Ruth. She shared her own small sign of hope, encouraging them to keep their faith alive. Time passed, and Ruth found herself more at peace. Then, one afternoon, her phone rang. It was a company she had applied 2 months ago. They wanted to interview her. Ruth felt a calmness she hadn't experienced before. She prepared, prayed, and attended the interview with a sense of trust that whatever happened, God was in control. A few days later, the call came. She had gotten the job. It was better than she had expected, a position that aligned with her passions and skills. Ruth sat in disbelief for a moment, then bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "not just for this job, but for teaching me to trust you." A week later, Ruth met Mrs. Clara for coffee again. "I got the job," Ruth said, beaming. Mrs. Clara smiled warmly. "I knew God had something in store for you." Ruth nodded, but her smile faded slightly. But the real gift wasn't just the job. It was learning to trust Him, even when I couldn't see what He was doing. I've realized it's not about getting what we want right away, it's about becoming who He wants us to be in the process. Ruth then shared her journal entries about the community and how their waiting stories had impacted her. Mrs. Clara's eyes twinkled. "That's the secret, my dear. His timing is always perfect. And remember, your journey can inspire others waiting for their own answers." As they left the cafe, Ruth felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wanted to share her experience and the lessons learned with others in her community, perhaps even starting a group for those waiting for their own answers. Thank you for watching. We sincerely hope you are encouraged. Please subscribe to our channel. Thank you.